You're just dead weight, my CEO said with a smirk as she fired me in front of the entire floor. I smiled and said, fine, fire me. The next day at the boardroom meeting, when she realized I owned 87% of the company and could remove her on the spot, she turned pale, and I took back everything she tried to destroy. The factory floor was buzzing with the usual Monday morning energy, clattering tools, muted conversations, and the low whine of engines being tested. I stood at my station, double-checking a shipment manifest, when Leona Prescott's stiletto heels clicked across the concrete like a metronome of doom. Leona had always loved making an entrance. She stopped right in front of my workstation, flanked by 2 security guards, her lips curved in that tight, insincere smile she wore whenever she was about to drop the axe. Nora Denton, she said in that falsely sweet tone that still made my skin crawl, you're done here. A hush fell across the floor. Even the guy next to me, who usually had his earbuds cranked up so loud you could hear the bass through his shirt, took them out. Leona's voice could do that, cut through noise like a knife. I turned to face her, feeling the eyes of every mechanic and analyst in the room boring into my back. I beg your pardon? I asked, keeping my voice calm. Leona's smile widened. You're fired. Effective immediately. She gestured with a manicured hand, dismissing me like a smudge on her designer jacket. We can't afford to waste resources on people who don't pull their weight. It's time to trim the fat. A low murmur swept through the room. I caught a glimpse of one of the younger engineers, Evan, staring at the floor like he'd just seen someone get shot. I took a slow breath and said, understood. Leona blinked, her smile faltering just a little. She'd wanted a scene. She'd wanted me to break down, to cry, to beg. But I wasn't going to give her that. That's it, she said, a faint edge of annoyance in her voice. You're not even going to defend yourself? No tears? No excuses? I shrugged. You're the boss. If you say I'm done, I'm done. Behind her, the 2 security guards shifted uncomfortably. I could see one of them looking at Leona, probably wondering why she wasn't getting the drama she'd hoped for. Fine, she snapped. Pack your things. You have 10 minutes. She turned on her heel and stalked off, her heels clicking away like gunfire. The security guards didn't move to grab me, they just stood there, looking vaguely embarrassed. I took my time gathering my things. I didn't have much: a battered thermos, a few folders of supply chain data, a photo of my grandfather in the first plane he ever built. My fingers lingered on that photo, tracing the outline of his old glider. Evan finally looked up. Nora. I'm so sorry. I offered him a small smile. Don't be. It's just business. He didn't know the half of it. I had gone undercover at Denton Aerotech, using my mother's last name so no one would know I was Nora Denton, the majority owner of the company. Leona had no idea who I really was. She thought she was humiliating some middle-aged supply analyst. In reality, she was accelerating my plan. As I walked out of the factory, I felt a flicker of excitement beneath the calm. My cover was gone, but that was part of the plan. Leona thought she'd won by getting rid of me. What she didn't know was that she'd just given me the perfect excuse to blow this whole thing wide open. I paused at the door, one last glance back at the factory floor where my family's legacy had been twisted by greed. My grandfather's company, now just another corporate trophy in Leona's cabinet. But not for long. As I stepped out into the bright morning air, I felt a surge of resolve. Leona wanted a show? She'd get one, just not the one she'd scripted. The next morning, I was sipping my coffee in the cramped kitchen of my company apartment, one of those prefabricated units Denton Aerotech provided for mid-level employees, when the knock came at the door. 3 quick raps, urgent but quiet. I set down my cup, feeling my stomach tighten. Only one person would come by this early, unannounced: Alan Cho. Alan was one of the few who knew my real identity. He'd been at the company long enough to remember my father's days, and he'd kept my secret all these months. He stepped in, closing the door behind him with a soft click. His face was pale, his normally neat hair slightly disheveled. They're moving fast, Nora, he said, his voice low. Too fast. I leaned against the counter, trying to keep my expression neutral. What did you hear? Alan ran a hand through his hair. Leona's got a list. Entire departments are being terminated tomorrow. Engineering R&D. She's calling it a strategic pivot, says it's to make the company leaner for potential investors. I felt a flash of cold rage. My family's company had always been about quality, about safety. Engineering wasn't just a department, it was the heart of Denton Aerotech. And Leona was about to rip it out to make a quarterly earnings report look better. She's gutting the place, I said quietly. Alan nodded, his shoulders slumping. It's worse than I thought. She's framing it like it's necessary for survival, but I think she's trying to make the company look appealing for a sell-off. There's talk about a merger with a foreign defense conglomerate. No one's saying it out loud, but I've seen the early drafts of the contracts. I took a deep breath, letting his words settle. This wasn't just corporate posturing. Leona wasn't trying to save the company. She was selling it off piece by piece. Thank you for telling me, I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Alan looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Nora, what are you going to do? This is moving faster than even you expected. I pushed away from the counter, my mind already racing. I'm going to have to move up the timeline. I thought I'd have a few more weeks to gather evidence to get everything in place. But if Leona's cutting the heart out of this company tomorrow, I can't wait any longer. Alan exhaled, rubbing his eyes. You're going to reveal yourself, aren't you? I met his gaze evenly. I don't have a choice anymore. She's going to destroy everything my grandfather built. Everything my father protected. I won't let that happen. Alan swallowed hard. I'll do what I can to help. But be careful, Nora. Leona's not going to take this lying down. I managed a small smile. Neither will I. For a moment we stood in silence, the weight of what was coming hanging in the air between us. Outside, the sun was coming up, casting long shadows across the little kitchen table. It felt like the calm before the storm. Alan finally straightened. I'll keep my ears open. If I hear anything else, you'll be the first to know. I nodded. Thank you, Alan. For everything. As he left, I sat back down at the table, staring into the cold coffee I'd forgotten about. My hands were steady, my mind already shifting gears. The time for watching was over. Tomorrow, the bloodletting would begin. And I'd be ready to stop it one way or another. That afternoon, after Alan's warning, I drove out to the old hangar on the edge of town, the original Denton workshop my grandfather built back in the 50s. It was just a rusted-out relic now with broken windows and cracked concrete, but it was still the place where it all began. I parked my car in the gravel lot, stepping out into the warm breeze. I hadn't been here in years, but the memories flooded back as I pushed open the dented metal door. The smell of engine oil and sun-warmed dust hit me like a punch of nostalgia. My grandfather, Peter Denton, had built his first glider here. I remember the stories my dad used to tell, how Peter would work long hours in this drafty shed, sketching out ideas on scraps of paper and cobbling together prototypes from whatever materials he could afford. He'd sold those gliders out of the back of his pickup, slowly building a reputation for reliability and craftsmanship. I walked deeper into the hangar, my boots echoing on the concrete. Old blueprints lined the walls, curling at the edges. The paint was peeling, but the spirit of the place was still here. My dad used to say the hangar had a soul, that it had soaked up every dream, every triumph, and every failure of the Denton family. I stopped in front of the old workbench, running my fingers over the deep scratches in the wood. My dad had added those marks, hammering out the first parts of the passenger planes that would make our company a national name. He believed in the importance of doing things the right way, even when it was harder. When he died suddenly, I was thrown into the whirlwind. I'd been his right hand, but not yet the leader. The board saw that as a weakness, as an opportunity. That's when Leona came in. I still remembered the day the board announced her appointment. They praised her aggressive growth strategy, called her a visionary. I'd been too raw, too broken by grief to see it for what it was, the first step in turning my family's company into something unrecognizable. At the time, I thought maybe it would work out. Maybe she'd bring in new ideas without tearing down what mattered. But as the years passed, it became clear that Leona didn't care about the legacy. She cared about power. About turning my family's name into a brand she could sell to the highest bidder. I knew I couldn't stop her by playing the part of the loyal executive. So I stepped away publicly at least. I let the board believe I was too grief-stricken to stay. And then I re-entered the company quietly, under my mother's last name, as just another analyst in the supply chain. Watching. Waiting. I leaned against the workbench, closing my eyes. My dad had taught me that quality was everything. That if you cut corners, it would always come back to bite you. That the people who worked the line, who assembled the planes, were the backbone of everything. He'd never let me forget that, and I wasn't about to forget it now. I took out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd collected over the past year. Images of parts swapped for cheaper materials, safety tests rushed or skipped entirely, projects that should never have left the ground. Proof that Leona wasn't just a bad CEO, she was a threat to everything Denton Aerotech had stood for. I felt a surge of anger, hot and steady. My father had given his life to this company. My grandfather had poured his dreams into these walls. And now it was up to me to stop Leona from turning it all to dust. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took one last look around the hangar. This was where it had started. And soon it would be where it all changed again. I walked back out into the late afternoon sun, the hangar's shadow stretching long across the gravel. My mind was clear. I wasn't just fighting for a company. I was fighting for a legacy. And I was done hiding. The morning after I was fired, I woke up to a hard knock at the door. Sunlight was streaming through the blinds, but my heart was already pounding as I slipped out of bed and pulled on a sweater. I had a feeling I knew who it was. 2 HR reps stood in the hallway, clipboard in hand. One of them, Carla, a quiet woman with kind eyes, wouldn't meet my gaze. The other, a man named Paul, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Denton," he said, his tone formal, like he was reading from a script. "We're here to finalize your separation paperwork and go over the non-disclosure agreement. You'll need to vacate company housing by end of day." I folded my arms across my chest. "Is that everything?" Paul shifted, glancing at Carla. Also, we need you to sign a document stating that you return all company property. Keys, laptop, ID badge, the usual. I nodded slowly. Of course. They handed me the paperwork and I signed it without a word. Carla watched me with a flicker of something like regret in her eyes, but she didn't say a thing. Once they left, I sat at my little kitchen table and stared at the pile of papers. So this was it. My cover was gone. My apartment was no longer mine. And yet, I felt calm, maybe calmer than I had in weeks. A few hours later, I was packing my boxes when my phone buzzed with a message from Jesse, one of the engineers I'd gotten to know over the past year. Jesse, Nora, can we talk? Me, of course. What's up? He called me immediately, his voice low and urgent. Nora, I don't know how much you know about what's going on, but they've been faking the safety tests. On the new jetliners. I felt the blood drain from my face. Faking? How do you know? I've seen the data, he said, his voice cracking. The stress test reports are all forged. They're shipping planes that haven't been fully vetted. And Leona's the one signing off on it. My fingers tightened around the phone. This wasn't just about layoffs or the bottom line. This was a direct threat to everything the Denton name had ever stood for: safety, integrity, lives. Why are you telling me this? I asked softly. Because I know you're not just some analyst, Jesse said, his voice shaking. I don't know exactly who you are, but I know you care about this company. You're the only one who might be able to stop her. I closed my eyes, letting his words sink in. I'd suspected corners were being cut, but hearing it confirmed like this, it made my stomach twist. My dad used to say that every bolt, every weld in a plane had to be worthy of the sky. That lives depended on it. Leona was throwing that away for a quick profit. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. Keep your head down, Jesse. I'll take care of it. We hung up and I sat there for a long time, staring at the boxes of my life in the half-empty kitchen. My heart was racing, but my mind was crystal clear. There was no going back now. Leona wasn't just cutting jobs or playing games with investors. She was risking lives. And that was a line I wouldn't let her cross. I reached for my father's old flight logbook, the one I'd carried with me since the day he died. Flipping through those worn pages, I found the note he'd scribbled in the margin of his first solo flight. Do it right. No shortcuts. Ever. I traced those words with my thumb and took a deep breath. Leona had pushed too far. She'd forgotten what this company was built on and who it belonged to. I wasn't just going to take back my company. I was going to make sure that every plane we put in the sky was something my father would be proud of. And that meant it was time to stop hiding. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I packed up the last of my things from the company apartment and loaded them into my car. Then I slipped back into my old executive attire, the tailored navy blazer, the crisp white shirt, clothes I hadn't worn since I'd stepped down after my father died. As I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing out the lapels of my jacket, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The analyst was gone. The true owner of Denton Aerotech was ready to reclaim her place. I spent the rest of the morning finalizing my plan. I'd already prepared a detailed presentation outlining every piece of evidence I gathered: the forged safety tests, the unauthorized outsourcing deals, the layoff plans that would gut the company's soul. Every damning fact was backed up with documents, emails, signatures. I reached out to Alan, who was already working behind the scenes to line up a shareholder meeting. It's happening today, I told him. Are you ready? I'll be there, Alan said, his voice steady. The board doesn't know what's coming. But they need to. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thank you. For everything. Before heading out, I checked my email one last time. That's when I saw it. A leaked press release Alan had managed to intercept. Denton Aerotech was set to announce a merger with Orion Defense Systems, a foreign conglomerate known for cutting corners and ignoring safety protocols. Reading those words, my jaw clenched. Leona was gambling with the lives of everyone who would ever fly in one of our planes. And she was doing it behind the backs of the people who built this company from the ground up. I printed out the release and tucked it into my folder. One more piece of evidence to bring to the board. I walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind me with a final click. I wouldn't be coming back here. When I returned, it would be to my grandfather's office, to the place that was rightfully mine. As I drove through the city, I thought about the people I'd come to know in the past year. The line workers who took pride in every rivet and weld. The engineers who stayed late to make sure the planes were perfect. The quiet men and women who believed, like my father did, that cutting corners wasn't just bad business, it was an insult to everyone who'd ever trusted us to keep them safe. They deserved better. My family's legacy deserved better. When I arrived at the headquarters, I parked in the visitor lot, the same lot I'd been forced to use as Nora Daly, the mid-level analyst. I walked up the steps, head held high, my folder of evidence clutched tight in my hand. Alan met me in the lobby, his eyes flicking to the suit, the determined set of my jaw. You look ready, he said. I managed a tight smile. I am. He handed me a small device, a flash drive loaded with the full presentation. Everything you need is on here, he said. Once you're in that boardroom, they won't be able to ignore you. Thank you, Alan, I said. Truly. He gave a short nod. Go remind them who really owns this company. I took a breath and turned toward the elevators. As the door slid shut behind me, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. No more hiding. No more playing by someone else's rules. Leona thought she'd gotten rid of me when she fired me. She had no idea that she'd just given me everything I needed to bring her down. I closed my eyes and pictured my father's face, the quiet pride he'd worn every time we talked about the company he loved. And I promised him, right then and there, I would make this right. The elevator chimed and I stepped out onto the top floor. The boardroom was waiting. It was time to take back what was mine. The boardroom at Denton Aerotech was a cavernous space lined with dark mahogany and gleaming brass. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the airstrip, a view that used to make me proud. Now it just reminded me of everything that had been twisted out of shape. The room was already buzzing when I walked in. Leona sat at the head of the long polished table, her expression carefully neutral. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment, the faintest flicker of surprise crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by that same tight smile she always wore when she thought she was in control. Nora, she said smoothly, her tone mocking, I thought we'd seen the last of you. I didn't waste time with small talk. I set my folder down on the table and met her gaze evenly. Leona, I'm here as the majority shareholder of Denton Aerotech. You'll address me accordingly. A ripple of confusion went through the room. The board members glanced at each other, then back at me. One of them, Martin, an older man who had always been more loyal to his pension than to any principal, cleared his throat. Nora, majority shareholder? I opened the folder and laid out the documents one by one. 87% of Denton Aerotech belongs to me. My grandfather built this company. My father carried it forward. And I will not let you destroy it. Leona's smile flickered again, but she leaned back in her chair, feigning boredom. This is highly irregular, she said coolly. You're not even on the board anymore. You have no standing. I have every standing. I cut in, my voice sharp. I've been watching, listening, and collecting evidence while you thought you were untouchable. Alan stepped forward and handed me the flash drive he'd prepared. I plugged it into the projector, and the screen behind me lit up with a presentation I'd spent months assembling. The forged safety reports, the falsified engineering tests, the plans for mass layoffs that would gut the heart of our workforce. And finally, the leaked merger contract with Orion Defense Systems. As the slides clicked by, the room fell into a stunned silence. The board members leaned forward, their eyes wide and mouths tight. Martin looked like he might be sick. When the last slide disappeared, I turned back to face them. This company was built on integrity and safety. Leona has turned it into a game of quick profits and reckless endangerment. I have the evidence, every signature, every email, every falsified report. And I will not let this stand. Leona's face had gone pale, but her voice was still steady. This is a gross exaggeration, she said, her tone icy. You're making baseless accusations. I raised my hand, cutting her off. The only baseless thing here is your leadership, Leona. You've endangered lives, betrayed the people who trusted you, and tried to sell off this company to the highest bidder. And you did it without the consent of the shareholders or the board. A heavy silence settled over the room. Finally, Alan spoke up, his voice calm but firm. As legal counsel, I can confirm that Nora's claims are backed by substantial evidence. These are not allegations, they're facts. I turned to the rest of the board, my pulse steady, my voice unwavering. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in Leona Prescott. Effective immediately. Leona stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. You think you can waltz in here and take back what you walked away from? You're just an analyst, Nora. You're nothing. I'm the owner, I said, my voice like steel. And I'm done letting you treat my family's legacy like your personal bank account. For a long moment no one moved. Then Martin cleared his throat again. I vote no confidence, he said, his voice trembling slightly. One by one the other board members followed. Some were hesitant, others quick to align with the new reality. But in the end, every hand went up except Leona's. When the last vote was cast, I felt something ease in my chest. A weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Leona's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but the words caught in her throat. In that silence I saw something shift behind her eyes, the first glimmer of real fear. The chairman of the board turned to me. Ms. Denton, he said carefully, the board has spoken. Leona Prescott is removed from her position as CEO. Effective immediately. I nodded once, my voice calm and resolute. Thank you. As I gathered my folder and stepped back from the table, Leona just stared at me, the woman she thought she'd crushed, now standing in the place she'd stolen. She looked like she wanted to speak, but no words came. For the first time in a long time I felt like myself again. I barely had time to breathe after the vote. Leona, still standing at the head of the table, her face pale but her eyes blazing, didn't even sit back down. She drew in a sharp breath and straightened her shoulders. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low and cold. "You think you've won, but you don't know what you're doing. You're in over your head, Nora." I tilted my head, my voice calm. "Funny. That's exactly what my father said the first time I flew solo. Turns out I handled it just fine." Leona's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "You're playing with fire," she said. "And if you're not careful, it'll burn this whole company down around you." I felt the weight of every word, but I didn't flinch. "If that's what it takes to get rid of you, I'll light the match myself." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, slamming it down on the table with a loud thud. "You're not as smart as you think, Nora. You didn't do your homework." She flipped it open, showing off official-looking legal documents. "This is a signed agreement with the top law firm in the city. They're backing me, and they'll tie you up in litigation until you're nothing but dust." The board members shifted in their seats, unease flickering in their eyes. Leona leaned in, her voice dripping with venom. "I've already filed an injunction against your motion. You can't remove me. I'll bury you in court costs before you even get to the discovery phase." For a moment the room was deathly still. Alan's expression tightened, but he didn't look panicked. I saw the flicker of confidence in his eyes, the same confidence that had kept me grounded through this entire ordeal. "Interesting," I said, my voice light. "Would you mind if I took a look at those contracts?" Leona hesitated, her jaw tightening. "They're legally binding, Nora. You don't need to see them." I raised an eyebrow. "I insist." Reluctantly, she shoved them across the table. I flipped through them, scanning the signatures, the letterhead, until my eyes caught the name of the supposed founding partner of the law firm. My heart skipped a beat, but my face stayed calm. "You know," I said lightly, "I happen to know the founding partner of this firm personally. He's an old friend of my father's. In fact," I paused, glancing at the board, "he's waiting in the hallway." Leona's expression cracked, her mouth opening slightly. "You're bluffing," she said, her voice brittle. I turned to Alan, who gave me a small nod and slipped out of the room. Less than a minute later the door swung open, and in walked Charles Avery, the real founding partner of Avery and Lane, a man whose handshake still carried the weight of decades of trust and friendship with my family. Charles adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped into the room. "Miss Denton," he said warmly. "Sorry for the delay." Leona's face went white as a sheet. "Charles, what are you doing here?" Charles ignored her completely, turning to me. "Nora, I understand there's been some confusion regarding these supposed documents." I handed them to him and he took his time, flipping through each page. When he was done he looked up, his face calm but his voice like steel. "These documents are forgeries. My firm never drafted them, never signed them. Whoever put this together did so to deceive this board." A stunned silence filled the room. Leona's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Forgery is a serious offense," Charles continued, his voice measured. "I'd advise the board to consider the implications of this kind of fraud." One of the board members spoke up, his voice shaking. "Leona, is this true?" Leona's eyes darted around the room. "You're making a mistake," she said again, but her voice had lost its edge. "You can't prove." Charles cut her off smoothly. "I'll be happy to provide a formal statement under oath." The last of the fight drained out of Leona's eyes. Her shoulders slumped, her mouth tightening in a bitter line. She looked at me one last time and for a moment, there was no rage left in her expression, just a flicker of something like defeat. Alan spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "With the evidence of fraud in the board's unanimous vote, Leona Prescott is removed as CEO of Denton Aerotech. Effective immediately." The finality of it settled over the room like a weight. Leona just stood there, her face pale and tight, as if she'd been hollowed out from the inside. I felt a rush of relief and something else too. A deep, quiet determination. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of everything my family had built finally being reclaimed. Leona turned and walked out of the boardroom without another word. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click, and for the first time in years, the room felt like it belonged to us again. The boardroom was quiet after Leona's exit, like everyone was waiting for me to say something, to fill the space she'd left behind. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all settle onto my shoulders, but this time it didn't feel heavy. Felt like home. I stood at the head of the table, the same spot where she'd tried to humiliate me not so long ago. The faces looking back at me were a mix of relief, curiosity, and a flicker of hope. "I know this has been a difficult time," I began, my voice calm but strong. "For all of us. Leona's decisions have put this company, and the lives of everyone who depends on it, at risk. I paused, meeting each set of eyes in turn. But Denton Aerotech was never just a corporation. It's a family. My grandfather built gliders in a dusty workshop because he believed that flight was about more than profit. My father carried that dream forward, never once cutting corners, never once compromising safety. I saw heads nodding around the table. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by something else, a quiet pride. I know many of you have been afraid to speak up, I continued. Afraid of what would happen if you challenged her. But today that ends. I reached into my folder and pulled out a fresh document, a new plan for Denton Aerotech, one that put people first. Effective immediately, we're ending the merger with Orion Defense Systems, I said, my voice steady. We're also reinstating the engineers and R&D teams Leona tried to cut. Every single one of them will have their job back by next week. There was a collective breath, and then a ripple of quiet applause. The sound was small, but it felt like the start of something big. And one more thing, I added. I'm creating a new seat on this board. One for an employee representative. Someone chosen by the people who make our planes, who know the difference between a spreadsheet and a rivet. No more top-down decisions made in secret. We're going back to the roots of this company. Transparency, safety, and respect. A soft murmur of approval ran through the room. Even Martin, who'd been so hesitant before, managed a small smile. Alan stood at my side, his hand resting lightly on the back of my chair. We'll make it happen, he said quietly, just for me to hear. I nodded. I know we will. We wrapped up the meeting quickly after that. The board members filed out one by one, each one stopping to shake my hand, to murmur their thanks. I could see the relief in their eyes, but also a glimmer of something more, belief. When the last of them had gone, I stepped out into the hallway. The employees were gathered in the break room just down the hall, word of the meeting already buzzing through the crowd. When they saw me, they fell silent, 1,000 unspoken questions in their eyes. I walked to the front of the room, my heart pounding but my voice steady. My name is Nora Denton, I said. And I'm here to tell you that everything you've heard about today is true. There was a ripple of surprise, then silence again. I took a breath and continued. I'm not just an analyst. I'm the owner of this company, and I've been watching. I've seen the way you work, the way you care. And I promise you, I will never let this place become something it was never meant to be. The words felt like they'd been waiting years to come out. And as I said them, I saw something shift in the crowd, shoulders straightening, eyes brightening. Hope. No more mass layoffs, I said firmly. No more cutting corners. From today on, we're going back to doing things the right way. The Denton way. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then someone at the back started to clap. Slow at first, then faster, spreading until the whole room was filled with applause. Real, genuine applause that filled the space where fear used to live. I felt a lump in my throat as I smiled. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A chance to rebuild, to honor everything my family had sacrificed for. As I stood there, the echoes of that applause ringing in my ears, I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't just carrying the weight of my family's legacy. I was sharing it with everyone who had always made this company what it was. And I knew in that moment we were going to make it soar again. The day after I took back control, I was in my father's old office. The one with the worn leather chair and the brass model of his first passenger jet on the shelf behind the desk. It felt surreal to be there again, but this time the weight on my shoulders didn't feel crushing. Felt right. I was flipping through the final draft of the reinstatement notices when I heard a commotion in the hallway, footsteps, voices raised in a tone that was too bright to be real. A moment later, Leona appeared at the door, flanked by security. She was dressed in the same navy dress she'd worn during the board meeting, but the confidence in her posture was gone. Her eyes were cold, her mouth twisted in a defiant little smile. So this is it, she said, her voice dripping with forced calm. You've won. Congratulations. I didn't bother standing up. I just closed the folder in front of me and met her gaze evenly. This was never about winning, Leona. It was about doing what's right. She let out a brittle laugh. Don't play the saint, Nora. You and I both know this is about control. About power. I shrugged. Maybe for you, but not for me. Leona's smile faded. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for some last scrap of leverage. You think they'll love you for this? She spat. You think they'll thank you when you're the one signing the checks, deciding who gets to stay and who doesn't? I tilted my head. The difference is I won't be doing it in secret. And I won't be risking lives to line my own pockets. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words seemed to die on her lips. For a moment I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then I remembered the terrified engineer who'd told me about the forged safety tests, the workers who'd begged me not to let the layoffs go through. "I won't let you rewrite this," I said quietly. "The board has voted. Your chapter here is closed." For a moment Leona just stared at me, like she couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream. Then she drew herself up, her shoulders straightening, and said in a clipped voice, "You're making a mistake." "I've made my choice," I said, my voice calm. She turned without another word and walked out, her heels clicking against the marble like gunshots. Security fell in step behind her, escorting her down the hall and out of the building she'd once ruled. Watching her go, I felt relief. Not triumph. Just relief. A few minutes later, Ellen appeared in the doorway, holding 2 champagne flutes and a bottle of the good stuff, the same vintage my father used to save for milestones. "I thought this might be appropriate," he said with a small smile. I stood up as he popped the cork, the sound echoing softly in the quiet office. He poured the bubbly, and we each took a glass. "To new beginnings," Alan said, raising his glass. I let out a breath and nodded. "To new beginnings," I echoed. We clinked glasses, the delicate ring of crystal filling the room. I took a slow sip, letting the bubbles tickle my throat. It tasted bright and clean, a promise that the darkness was finally clearing. Alan leaned against the edge of the desk, studying me over the rim of his glass. "You know, Nora," he said softly, "your father would be proud of what you did today." I felt my chest tighten, but it wasn't painful, it was something closer to peace. "I hope so," I said. "I really do." We fell into a quiet moment, the two of us just sipping our drinks and watching the sun sink lower over the airstrip outside. The late afternoon light painted the hangars in gold, the same color as the memories I'd carried with me all these years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what came next. I wasn't worrying about the next battle or the next crisis. I was just here in this office that had been my father's and was now mine. With Alan at my side, the company's future finally back in our hands. I set my glass down and looked out the window, a small smile playing at the corners of my mouth. "We've got a lot of work ahead," I said. Alan nodded, his eyes bright. "Yes, we do. But for today, this is enough." And it was. Because for the first time in years, I knew Denton Aerotech wasn't just surviving. It was back in the hands of the people who believed in it. The people who were ready to rebuild it, piece by piece, into something worthy of the name that was etched on every rivet, every wing, every dream that took flight.